well, we're close reaching the end of our Congress, and we didn't want to leave you without a vision for the future. In reality, when we listen about rendering products, our focus is towards animal food, but with these products, we can also assure healthy and plenty of food for the fertilizers that can be used. So fertilizers using animal meals is going to be approached from Dr. Rick, the organic fertilizers from Darling Ingredients. Apart from organic agriculture sales, Rick is responsible for all fertilizers, national and CESPR accounts, regularization and fulfillment as development of products, and new initiatives of development for markets for nature-safe fertilizers. Rick presently is part of the Directive Council of Organic Matters Council, where he presides the committees of finance and personnel. He's also a member of the founding alliance of Come Alive Outside, a non-profitable organization connected to green industry that advocates for investment and free air. He has occupied positions as brand manager and business manager, began his career in agro-industry 1990 up to 2014 in briefing industries and tablet ingredients, where he guided the efforts of marketing of the company. He'll be talking about how to feed the land, increasing the value of animal meals. Ladies and gentlemen, please a strong round of applause.
Good afternoon. Veronica and the guys in the back all did a great job moderating this, so let's give them a round of applause. Yep. You know, I've got good news and bad news. The good news, I'm your last speaker. You can welcome the clap. Go ahead and clap. Bad news is you guys are probably tired of sitting, so go ahead and stand up. Well, I'm going to go through the first couple slides. Go ahead and stand up. Just stretch. You guys have got to be tired of sitting. Let me tell you a little bit about what we've got today. We're going to talk about how we feed the soil from our animal proteins and really growing the value of our animal proteins. So here's a quick intro. Tell you a little bit about myself. Also, why we make our organic fertilizer that we brand as nature safe, the markets we serve. We'll talk about the feed to fertilizer methodology, and we'll talk about the value of the various rendered proteins from a fertilizer perspective. We'll talk about what determines an organic fertilizer's value, and then we'll do a little deeper dive in things that I think you guys are interested in, like meat and bone meal. We'll then do a case study and a model that talks really briefly about where impacts have been made on our rendered proteins and fats, as well as how that might correlate to some opportunities for our proteins in the role of fertilizer. Then we'll talk about the potential for renewable or rendered proteins moving forward. Real quick, I've worked for in this industry for 28 years, about half of that with Griffin Industries and the last half with Darling Ingredients. A lot of it in the value add category, making organic fertilizers in the renewable diesel space, or actually before that more biodiesel. So I've got a number of perspectives that I'd like to share relative to those correlations I was just outlining. First, and again, our brand is nature safe, but let me tell you why we exist. And there's really three reasons why our company started fertilizer. And I should mention, does anybody know what the first industry rendered proteins served? Anybody? Fertilizer, actually. Our company, Darling Ingredients, started in 1882. First market we served was fertilizer. So there's really three big reasons why we exist. One's pretty obvious. We're a profit center. So our fertilizer business has to generate a profit in order for it to be sustainable. Second is really an internal hedge for those animal proteins. So we tend to make a little bit wider margins when it's a bearish market for those proteins, and a little bit less of a margin when that's a bullish market. And then the last category is really what we call more of a contingency plan, or I like to call the island of misfit toys. We can take a product that is rejected as a feed, and we can on occasion find a home for that material in fertilizer, which avoids a trip as waste or a write-off or to the landfill. So we appreciate the opportunity to do that. It's a little bit more challenging with current regulations to be able to do that effectively, but we certainly see that as a value. Here's the markets we serve. And it's really kind of, organic agriculture, and this is, again, selling organic fertilizer as an organic input for a designated organic output. So organic agriculture is really critical for our growth. We also service various turf markets, so golf courses, sports turf, lawn care, and then we actually do some retail work where we serve the big box retailer, but really not in our Nature Safe brand. We do that more through private label relationships. So what are the key Darling generated inputs we use as fertilizer? These are all materials we've been talking about for the last 2 days. It's really, our feather meal, our meat and bone meal, our blood meal, those are all materials that find a home in fertilizer. So what's their fertility value? And again, when we think of fertilizer, we think of the 3 primary nutrients: nitrogen, phosphorus, which is available phosphate, and potassium, or soluble potash. First of all, feather meal. Feather meal is very high in organic nitrogen because it's high in protein. So the simple math is we take our protein percentage and divide by 6.25, and that'll tell you how much organic nitrogen you have from a rendered protein. So as you can see, with feather meal, we're getting 12 to 14% organic nitrogen from that material. Now, meat and bone meal is a little more balanced. You're seeing not just organic nitrogen, but you're also getting a lot of available phosphate and also calcium. So Dr. Starkey mentioned earlier in the first presentation about phosphorus and calcium being a big component to meat and bone meal. Certainly we see that as fertilizer as well, and that really does have a lot of value. Now, if you noticed, we're not seeing any potassium that we're really claiming here. Our rendered proteins are fairly low in potassium. So again, the real differentiating components where we see out of rendered proteins is organic nitrogen, available phosphate, and calcium. Now, there is a difference when I say available phosphate, and a lot of us are conditioned to think in feed terms about phosphorus or P. So when we think of like a meat and bone meal that might have, say, a 3% phosphorus, you might say, well, that's pretty low from an available phosphorus standpoint. But actually, the math is you take that phosphorus and you multiply by 2.29, and that'll give you your available phosphate. As a general rule, that works. So you'll see that we can have products that can be as high as 6 to 15% available phosphate in the form that we would call, in a general naming, as meat and bone meal. Bone meal, of course, is even upping that number more. So again, lowering the protein, you're increasing the phosphorus and the available phosphate or P2O5. And usually your phosphate and your calcium are a 1-to-1 ratio. So if you're high in phosphate, you're going to be high in calcium as well. And then lastly, blood meal. And blood meal is, again, from a nutrient standpoint or from a fertility standpoint, very similar to what you're going to see in feather meal. Our challenge is that it's a pretty volatile priced material, and as a result, it's also difficult for us to handle because it's pretty light from a bulk density standpoint. So what's our methodology? How do we take this feed approach and apply that to fertilizer? Well, ultimately, we're going to take the science and the expertise that we apply to animal feed and apply that to feeding a completely different ecosystem. In essence, we're feeding the soil. And those principles of how we feed a dog, a cat, a chicken are the same basic premise to how we feed the soil and ultimately the soil feeding the plant. So what determines an organic fertilizer's value? Well, it's really two primary things. One is simply how much organic nutrition we can stick in that formulation. So again, if you think about the protein message of how concentrated we can get that, then that's key. And it's not just that though. So again, it's how much protein, how much phosphorus, how much calcium is in that formula. That's certainly an important thing. And how we measure that is really those amino acids, those protein concentrations, just like you would measure a feed. But just as important is really the availability of those nutrients. So if they are, again, I could take my belt, which is obviously high and it's a leather belt, it's high in protein, but it's not very available. So same is true in feed, right? Same principles apply to fertilizer. If that protein is processed as a very available, very digestible feed, then that feed is going to do its thing as fertilizer because again, we're feeding soil microbes and those microbes are in turn mineralizing that nutrition and in turn feeding the plant. So the bottom line is really this, is that if it doesn't make a good feed, it actually doesn't make a good fertilizer. So the two are highly correlated. So a deeper dive on meat and bone meal. Fertilizer doesn't require, and I know this is unusual because of how feed works, but in fertilizer, we don't require species derivation. So early in my career with NatureSafe, we used to have on our labels things like pork meal and poultry byproduct meal and all that, and really designate those species. The challenge is from a regulatory standpoint, especially from an organic regulatory perspective, it became a little bit burdensome to actually do it that way. So we've actually taken a much more general approach and said meat and bone meal is meat and bone meal. And we don't get into the species derivations, be it porcine, or even in the case of poultry or ruminant. So we're very generic in our efforts. And the biggest reason why is because when we were doing that kind of species diversification, we found that we were making things much more difficult for ourselves, but the customer really wasn't accruing any value on those derivations. Another interesting point is that labeling in the US has one and only one BSE related restriction, which is do not feed to animals, and this is actually a quote, do not feed to animals or apply to pasture land for grazing animals. That's the extent of the restrictions in the use of fertilizer. Another fun fact is that, again, the US market is pretty strong in terms of organic agriculture and organic demand for fruits and vegetables. In fact, in Mexico, 80% of the organic production is actually exported to the United States. So the domestic consumption for that market is pretty light. And again, US market tends to dominate that demand. Here's the challenge. The organic demand is actually not growing at the same rate it was over the past 20 years. Now, there's a number of reasons why that is. Number one, it's kind of saturated. Two is that food inflation that's hit globally, I think, certainly in North America the last couple of years, is actually putting a bit of some headwinds on the demand for organic fruits and vegetables. It's still growing, it's just a much more moderate growth curve. The meat and bone meal value impact. As a result, in my opinion, simply targeting organic fertilizer will not have a significant impact on the volumes or the demand, or again, ultimately the value of meat and bone meal. So as much as that market is meant to what I do for a living, it's not a market that I can feel confident is going to change the metrics for our industry in terms of the ultimate value of those feedstocks. There is already a value backstop for meat and bone meal. In fact, in the States especially, poultry manure has a value. Out of the poultry house, that value can range in US dollars from $30 to say $50 a ton. That's as a raw material coming out of the house. Now, typically, an NPK value of poultry manure is about a 333. So our meat and bone meal will have a value, again, all things being equal, of about 2.5 to 3 times what that baseline is or what that opportunity cost is relative to manure. So in very simple terms, there is a value or there's a backstop for meat and bone meal. The problem is that value is below the feed value. So it's really not serving our industry or serving us to any real extent. It's just there. Now let's talk about the opportunity. You know, we have a working model as an industry. You know, and you know, feel free to yell out what you think this is, but what initiative over the past 10 years has had the greatest impact on the demand and ultimately the value of our rendered products? Anybody? Renewable diesel? Yeah, renewable diesel has had a dramatic impact on the value of our fats and oils, right? Guiding principles for renewable diesel. Again, I mentioned in my intro, I spent the first 10 plus years of my career clawing our way out of biodiesel, trying to sell my soul to sell yellow grease derived biodiesel to anyone that would buy it. It was a really tough task because we were very much competing for the right to compete, trying to compete as these recycled feedstocks that were at a lower cost or value, clawing our way into the game of a renewable fuel. It's very difficult. But these were the guiding principles. And this goes back, I mean, Griffin Industries, our legacy company that I was a part of, started making biodiesel in the late 1990s, before biodiesel was even recognized as an approved alternative or renewable fuel. But here's the principles. 1, domestic economic development. I think any initiative is going to have that as a takeaway. 2, reduce dependency on foreign oil. And then 3, sustainability. And sustainability can be framed a few different ways. It can be sustainability in terms of extending a finite resource in the form of petroleum. It can be sustainability in terms of emissions reductions or greenhouse gas reductions. So there's a number of different ways to use that as a message, but it's really that big bucket of sustainability. And again, I prefer to think of that in terms of how do we extend a finite resource. So again, I'm not sure there's a right or a wrong answer here, but which of those 3 had the most impact in terms of renewable diesel success? Any thoughts? I'm not sure there's a right answer, but I would argue that there's some things that really are impacting it. And again, if you think of the realities of, I would probably argue that reducing dependency on foreign oil is what caused a lot of activity in terms of incentives and mandates and things that we really feel like we were able to take advantage of. But again, let's look at conventional fertilizer now and think of that for a moment. Global supply. Yell it out if you know. Who's the largest exporter of fertilizer from a country standpoint? First answer was Russia. I'd love to give you a prize, I got nothing. But the answer is Russia. Next question, global demand. Who's the largest consumer of conventional fertilizer? Who's got all the right answers here? It's China. Now, you would have guessed that probably, because again, who's the largest in terms of population? So there's some logic there for sure, but yeah, it's China. Now, what conventional nutrient supply, this is a curveball, what conventional fertilizer supply is most threatened? And let me just throw out your options. Nitrogen, available phosphate, potassium, soluble potassium. Somebody said rock phosphate? Is that? I agree. I think it's phosphate derived from rock phosphate, because again, it's mined, it's a finite resource. That's where all phosphorus comes from. Fun fact of how they do it. They mine rock phosphate, and then they react that phosphate, that rock, with sulfuric acid, which makes, anybody sit in the front row of chemistry class? Phosphoric acid, correct. So the supplies, depending on the article you read, rock phosphate has anywhere from a 30 to 300 year global supply. Now, if you're a pessimist, that's getting kind of close to the bone, right? That's really close. I plan on living 30 plus years. That's in my lifetime, that could run out. Big concern. The risk. Again, it's a primary nutrient. We have a growing global population. We're at what, 8 billion people today? 30 years from now, that might be what, 10 billion? Depending on, again, what article you read. We have to feed a growing population. It's a really important role that our industry has as well, because if you think about what we do, our CEO made an interesting comment in a presentation to our employees about a week and a half ago, and he said, Randy Stewie, our CEO, said, you know, when we look at value, when we look at how we maximize value for our proteins and our fats, it's not just capitalistic greed. If you think of this from a philanthropic standpoint, the more value we create for our proteins, our fats, the more affordable food becomes for the world. That's a really noble goal. And I became really excited about just making that correlation. But again, back to this risk, we see, you know, if we've got these challenges and we say, well, what else is there? What other concerns are there from a rock phosphate standpoint? Because we're just talking about how our proteins like meat and bone meal is really high in available phosphate. But what are the other challenges or geopolitical concerns? Well, I'm going to zip through the top 8 exporters of rock phosphate. This is a little misleading because it's actually a vertical listing, even though it came up kind of horizontal, but Egypt is number 1, Jordan, Morocco, Togo, Peru, India, Pakistan, Syria. A couple things in common there, right? Nothing right next door, nothing really close. Some of that coming mostly from a lot of it coming from the Middle East, where our relations in North America may be a little bit strained. So are those concerns? Are those things that could create action? I think it's something we ought to be talking about. And again, meat and bone meal is an excellent source of phosphate. You take that phosphorus, again, we're all conditioned to think of phosphorus as P. Available P2O5 is P times 2.29. So it is a much more significant contributor in the world of fertilizer. So let's go back to the renewable diesel drivers. You know, we had those 3 things, right? Domestic economic development. We talked about reduced dependency on foreign oil. Then, of course, there's that sustainability issue of how do we extend a finite resource? Now, let's just change the terminology. Let's take the exact same principles and plug in fertility-related messaging. So again, economic development is economic development. I would argue that any program or initiative would always have that, so that's kind of just the standard. But reducing dependency on foreign fertilizer supply, is that a driver? I think it could be, especially today. What about sustainability? Extending a finite life of that material. Is that a driver? Again, if you're looking at 30 to 300 years, I think it is. And then ultimately, again, meat and bone meal has the greatest impact on phosphate challenges because it's a controlled release. We haven't really talked about that in this presentation's a little too short to get into the nitty-gritty of the science of how that mineralization process works, but it is very much a controlled release fertilizer, which also has value. And because of that concentration, it can improve the efficacy of conventional nutrients. I do this in my own world here in the fertilizer space. We do some fortified products with ammonium sulfate, with stabilized ureas, with methylene ureas, and we see this synergy from a conventional nutrient standpoint. We see the 1 + 1 = 3. And I think that's really a powerful thing. So ultimately, and then to make this point is we're feeding the soil, right? And how we do that is we explode beneficial bacteria populations. That's how the mineralization process works. We had to go back to the 1930s textbook on earth science to really find this, but this is Dr. E.C. Roberts' Biology of Soil. And what he's saying here is just this, that we see this amazing level of efficiency from our animal or rendered proteins. And why is because it's not just the ability to mineralize the carbon, mineralize the protein, mineralize the nutrition that comes from our animal proteins. It's also the fertilizer factory effect, the fact that we explode those beneficial bacteria populations, and by so doing, those populations then die and decompose. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. And when that happens, those elevated microbe populations deliver a 10-5-2 fertilizer value as well. It's why the longer you use a rendered protein as an organic fertilizer, the more efficient that fertility acts. Because it's not just getting out what you're putting in, it's creating this effect right here. So where do we start? Well, let's not make this any harder than it needs to be. We already have a success. Actually, the most incredible success our industry has ever seen in the form of renewable diesel, right? So let's look at that playbook. Let's look at how we were able to execute against those challenges, because I can tell you, being in that first generation on the biodiesel side, it was sweat and toil. It was a lot of challenge. It was pushing the wet noodle up the rope type challenge. We have a success story, and it's really just been over the last 10, 12 years. And look at the impact. It's unbelievable the impact that success model has created. Industry support. The people here in this room need to be part of this discussion, which is really why I'm here. So again, NARA, FPRF, others in this industry that again let's look at this from a philanthropic standpoint. Our ability to maximize the value for these proteins, maximize the value for these fats, maximizes our industry's ability to help feed this world. I think that's a very, very noble task. We need a compelling call to action. That's something that I'm not going to be here to tell you exactly what it is, but I think there's a couple of drivers. I think there's, sustainability is a big driver. Reducing dependency on foreign fertilizer supplies is a big driver. Being able to feed our great-great-great-great-grandchildren, pretty darn big driver. Again, those current geopolitical unrest is actually a critical success factor. I would argue that was one of the key drivers for renewable diesel as well. So the potential impacts. Again, let's look at renewable diesel. In my relatively, 28-year career, half of my life I've spent in this industry. So I can remember 7-cent yellow grease, under 10-cent animal fats. It wasn't all that long ago. It wasn't like on year 20, year one. It wasn't all that. It was less than 20 years ago. I remember that. What is it today? And obviously, we're seeing a little bit of a pushback on some pricing, but we've seen pricing well over 50 cents a pound. That's exponential. That's exponential growth in the value of those fats. So why can't we do the same thing for our rendered proteins? In fact, I would challenge us that we have to do something similar, because we're going to get to the point with all these additional renewable diesel plants coming online around the globe. that there's going to be a lot of soybeans crushed, and even though there's different CI scores there, there's going to be a lot of oil being generated, not for the protein value, but for the oil. So, again, we might be moving the roll of quarters from the left pocket to the right pocket here. We need to think about how we can monetize and value our animal proteins. So what's needed? We need research. That's why we need to engage. We've got some research on that we've done, and we're happy to talk about that in terms of how we feed the soil, how we have impacts in some other areas as well. There's a lot of neat little terms like competitive exclusion in addition to the fertilizer factory effect, and there's very interesting terms and research that we have done that has validated how our products work. We need legislation. Right? When you're talking about macroeconomics, and it doesn't matter if we're talking about petroleum, or we're talking about conventional fertilizer, it doesn't just happen. We need change agents, we need some lobbying, and ultimately from that, and again, being weaned as a family-owned company for half of my career, we didn't use these terms. We don't like subsidies. We didn't like tax, I shouldn't say that. We did like tax incentives. And we certainly didn't like mandates, but those were the things that were needed to launch renewable diesel into the stratosphere, to create this rising tide that has very much risen all ships. So what are those catalysts again? The geopolitical unrest from leading fertilizer exports, as much as that dominates the news and it's all doom and gloom, it's actually a catalyst to make this a reality. Waning global supplies, the reality of that is an absolute catalyst. We have to recognize that we're dealing with, in the case of phosphorus or phosphate, and even in the case of potassium, finite resources. We need to creatively address that to extend those life expectancies or the functional life of those finite resources. And we need to increase demand-driven, we need increased supply, actually, which is driven by the demand to feed a growing population. Again, if 30 years from now, that's 10 billion people, that's a lot of people. And we really have to address that. We need to feed and protect one of our world's most precious resources. We haven't really talked about this yet, but ultimately the soil. However many inches of topsoil we're dealing with, that is an incredibly valuable asset. You could make a very strong argument it is one of our very most precious natural resources. And what do we do for rendered proteins? We feed that soil. We maximize the value of that soil. There's plenty of manures out there that can actually help or amend the soil, but they don't do what rendered proteins do, which is feed the soil so that the soil can in turn feed the plant and we can feed the world. And then of course, sustainability. Animal protein's value proposition of feeding the soil and improving nutrient availability should represent real synergy with conventional nutrients. We're not a displacement as much as we're a value add. And that's, again, when you look at renewable diesel, it's not to displace petroleum, it's to maximize the value of petroleum, to get other benefits from petroleum. So, oops, let me go back a sec. I forgot that last little thing. We really do need to dig our well before we're thirsty. And I think of this, and I think of it in I mentioned a quote from Randy Stewie, our CEO at Darling Ingredients, and it reminded me of another quote that I absolutely adore. I bore my kids with any chance I can, which is, we get anything we want out of life, right? So long as we help enough other people get what they want. Now that's a lot of words to fit on a coffee mug, but I really think, I believe that's a mantra that we can stand behind. Here's my contact information. I know we're a little short on time, so I'm happy to answer questions afterwards, but we really do appreciate you and appreciate this industry. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much.